I would now like to introduce you to today's presenter, Matt Donovan. As the GP Strategy's Chief Learning and Innovation Officer, Matt Donovan brings more than 25 years of experience to the L&D space. Throughout his career, he has helped support a wide range of global Fortune 500 companies through significant transformation initiatives. Not only has he been recognized through the industry awards, he also publishes articles and presents at a variety of national and international conferences and in industry publications. He has an MS in Instructional Systems Technology from Indiana University. So, Matt, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. I'm looking forward to a great session here. Obviously, we have a short amount of time on one of my most passionate topics, and it's one that's actually getting a lot of attention, a lot of notoriety. A lot of folks have been talking about design thinking, a lot of conversations around the topic. So I thought it would be a conversation that we could have very quickly to really look at, as folks have started to apply design thinking, how to avoid some common pitfalls and really use it to drive some results. And so I think it's really a critical conversation that we have as we start to really apply the concepts of design thinking, integrate it more into the L&D space. Like a lot of things, in order to do it well, it's not just about repeating the process, it's following the spirit and the intent behind the process as well. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to cover a couple of different topics today as we go through. As I mentioned, feel free to pull your questions in. Would love to be able to answer them as I go, and we'll have some opportunity at the end as well. So let's jump right in and take a look at why do we really need the new approach? What is the situation or the behaviors that are really calling for the value behind design thinking? And in the origins of when we look at design thinking, it was really come across to tackle what was referred to as wicked problems. And wicked not as in malicious, but the intent was around wicked referring to complex or ambiguous situations, places where we didn't have well-routinized answers, well-defined answers. So the concept of design thinking was an approach that came out to really start to get to, when you don't know what the solution is, how do you actually wrap the right people around the right process to get to what that solution is? So this is an example of what we have, and I've been on projects where I've exhibited these same experiences here. So if you look to the left, we start off with what it is, how folks may have thought about a project or initiative. On a learning event, we get together and we say we need to build something from the learner. We include the clients, the PMs, the instructional designers, the business consultants. They all have very different opinions on what really needs to be built. No real conversation that goes through to get us aligned. There's one clear player not at the table, the learner or the performer. And then what happens is we end up building something that looks a lot like what's in the center, when what the learner really needed was the elegant solution on the right-hand side. So the idea is to how do we kind of get around this process? And when we don't know really what the learner wants or what the learner needs, how do we actually pull a process in that's going to really start to meet their needs? And that's where the design thinking comes in. It's really around what we call human-centered design. And it's about putting the human first, the learner, the performer, the user, all of that about being at the center of what we're trying to design for. And it wraps in a couple of different disciplines: the design of an experience, design thinking as a practice, user experience, service design, creative intelligence, and systems thinking. So all these things bring in a lens around what we call that human-centered design, putting the human at the center of whatever we're trying to build or drive. Now, many of you have probably seen design thinking framework out there. There's plenty of them out there, but this is probably one of the most common. When you look at the five-step process here, you start off with empathy, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing as we go left to right. Now, where I'm really going to focus today is when we're trying to think about how can we create or define a really powerful, engaging learning journey for a learner, with learning outcomes being the primary goal of what we're trying to do. How can we actually create the best experience possible for that learner? What's the most consumable, usable, going to drive to meet their needs, bringing the most relevant solutions to the table? So this process is when you would start to bring a design thinking approach to the table. So the first one, when you look at the empathy side of things, is we really want to start first and foremost with who are we designing for? What do we know about them? What can we learn about them? And that's where learner segmentation and learner personas come in. And so that either starts with empathetic interviews with the actual learners or the performance support group, trying to get and uncover what their needs, their feelings, their emotional components, as well as their intellectual needs, really trying to pull forward from the actual end users of the experience, what it is that they want to see, feel, think, do with the whole experience. So bringing that empathy to the table. And learner segmentation and learner personas are two great ways to get that jump started so that you can anchor the whole experience around, again, who are we designing for? And once we've done that, you move into the second phase, which is really defining the what are we trying to solve, the why. What are the problems that are emerging, the challenges that we're really trying to ultimately ideate a solution towards helping resolve for them. And so that's where we look at things like problem statements, defining criteria for the experience, what are some challenges that we'll be able to solve for them. So now we've gone through with, who are we building for, what are we trying to solve for them, the why behind that. And then you move into the third phase, which is really around the ideation. And this is where you're trying to bring and expand the way in which you're looking at the challenges. And informed about who you're building for, how are you bringing in not only really good, solid, evidence-based practices to design or pull forward the experience, but what is the most creative, innovative way that you can help meet their solutions? And the idea here is to kind of really go wide, be able to bring in as many creative solutions as possible. So there's two phases in the ideation where you're really what I call the divergent phase, where you're trying to bring in as many innovative ideas, approaches, or features into the solution or the experience that you're defining. And then there's the convergence side, is where you go through a process of being able to prioritize and separate where you want to start the prototyping process to move forward. So that's the convergence side, is where you're coming back into, so where are we going to start to build some things? And this is a critical underlying component of the whole process, is that this is not a creative process. This isn't just about generating really cool ideas and cool things. Design thinking only works when it results and is driven through action, which is really what brings us to the last two steps in the process, which are really around that prototype and test phase, where you're actually creating prototypes and you're putting them in front of your target audience. You're getting feedback. How well did it work? You're bringing in what you know about the personas to help reflect on that, the experience criteria that you pulled from the definition phase, and you're actually putting it in front of actual users to get their feedback on it. And then that's really what that test side is, and then so it cycles back through this. Now, a lot of people think that, this looks like a very linear process. You clearly just move from one stage to the other. But in reality, it is actually a nonlinear process. In many ways, you may move into the definition phase and go back and adjust what you may have learned or refine your understanding of who the learners are or your target audience. You may be getting into, coming out of the ideation phase, and it may have a refinement during that conversation where you're refining your understanding of the problem and the challenge. So as you can imagine, you can move back and forth through these. It is cyclical in nature. Although it's very clean and forward-moving, it is important to understand that it is a nonlinear process. So I think when you're really trying to come to being able to use it, the idea is to manage it really well. And this is when we look at bringing it into the L&D space, what we're finding is that if you don't have that new design thinking mindset, it can be problematic if you're actually looking at it from, a traditional perspective. And so what I mean is so for example, I got a comparison here between design thinking and the linear Addi process, which is traditionally more of a waterfall gate-driven process. Analysis, design, development, pulling through, design thinking, being more one that's dealing with the challenging nonlinear process around it. So the fundamental assumption here around design thinking is that it's focused first on the who, the why, and how before you get to the content, before you get to the content structure. It's not that content's not important, but if you think about our Addi process, we often focus on the content and the solution is to be defined first before we go into development. So there's a gate. We have generally a high-level design document. We sign off and we say, this is what we're going to build. Then we move into development. Whereas in the design thinking, we go more about the experience and the who and the why long before we get into the content. And then the prototype and testing actually help us refine that solution over time. The focus of the process is on the learners, the teams that are actually coming together to apply the design thinking, and the interactions between those. Linear Addi is really around a systematic process for design, so it's a lot about the process and the tools. I think when I look at the method for managing change, this is important because when you think a lot about how we apply project management towards this, in the Linear Addi process, when it's waterfall, you're going through a gate. We signed off on a design document. Now we know what we're building. We're going to move forward. Any changes after that sign-off generally is a scope negotiation. In the design thinking process, we are bringing that change as a critical part of that process. As we are uncovering refined understandings or more information, we're pulling that more progressively through the process. When we think about the measure for effectiveness is really trying to get to that learner-centric solution that's effective as we measure it put before the learners. We're getting data that supports it. Well, how do we know we've completed the Addi process well? We know that we've completed the stages. There's been a sign-off. There's been a product at the end. The product can always be evaluated, but we know that the process was complete because it actually had several gates that were completed versus the learner-centric, which is actually progressing through a process and an experience to come up with the most learner-centric experience. And then the last one is just really around that change, is being able to embrace or control the changes we're moving through it. Embracing that change is the design thinking, is being open to that, to change our understanding as we learn more about and build on our understanding of the learners and their needs, versus Addi is really about trying to control that change. So here's a couple of myths that we have thinking about design thinking, and when we look at agile development for that prototype and test when we come into that. And so I pulled a couple of these, and I'll highlight a couple of them for you. I've already hit on some of these, but one of my things is that a lot of folks think that design thinking is really about creating new products. And really, we've been able to find ways to create new learning journeys, new learning experiences, bringing into things that are complex and ambiguous solutions for our learners. So it's a great way to do that. It's not just about generating ideas, I mentioned before. It's actually about moving action and progressing. This is a great one here, that there's one size set of tools and templates that you actually follow through. It's a very consistently repeatable process that has kind of the same experience all the way through it. I have found that while we may move through the process in a fairly consistent manner, and as I mentioned, we may jump back around some areas, but we do progress through it. The experience of the journey is really uniquely tied to the people that we're bringing to the table, who we're building for, and the conversation and where they're at in that journey. So it may look actually very different based on each group and the exercise that we're running. The last one I think is really the call out is like it can be optimized through a transactional process. You know, this is not about a transactional, hey, can't we just send an email around, we all agree what we need to do, let's move on. It's about a group of folks coming together, sharing in a great process that helps us rapid thinking around who we're designing for and what are we solving for them. Here are 10 principles, and I've kind of called this out and really looking at applying design thinking specifically to a learning journey, not just trying to create a new learning product, but really thinking about how would I create a great experience or a journey for them. So starting off with here, first of all, is know who to bring to the table. You want to bring a range of people to the process. You want not just one instructional designers or the subject matter experts. You want to bring in the business, the support folks, the learners themselves. You want to bring them into that process. Focus on the motivated individuals. This is a process that has a high energy factor to it, a lot of great conversation, but if you give them the environment, the support, and the trust to drive the process, those motivated individuals will carry you through a fantastic experience. Again, start with understanding who you're designing for. That has to be first and foremost with everything you do. Know who you are designing for. Jumping to number 5 here, don't overmanage the process. Encourage wild ideas. Bring things that are coming in. Try and dig out and move past some of the biases that we may have over legacy solutions, legacy approaches. Let's see. One of my other, favorite one here is number 8, where I really like to talk about managing the concept of the minimal viable product, which this is one of the most important stages. This is one area that a lot of folks struggle with because they really don't know how to define that. And so I wanted to kind of jump forward real quick on that one and show you what I mean on an example. And I think this is a great idea here. So this is a great graphic pulled here, and you can see the reference down here. But I love this because it really highlights one of the fallacies we have when we think of what we call a minimum viable product, which is the smallest thing of what we're trying to build. So, traditionally we may start off, if our goal is to kind of design a car at some point, we may start off with one wheel, and then we go to 2 wheels, the body, and then we go to the car. And the problem is that you do not have a testable version of the vehicle that meets the concept of transportation. So if you look at the bottom here, this means I need to be able to move a person from point A to point B. We start off with the minimum viable product would be a skateboard. It has everything I need to move me from point A to point B. Then I move to option 2, gives me a little more control with a handle, something more like this with a bicycle, more speed, more power, maybe a little more control. Then I move into adding a motor to it, to a motorcycle, or now I can actually move myself without getting wet in the rain, etc. These would all be testable, minimal viable products. And this is one of the challenges, I think, that when we get into coming up with great ideas, we have a hard time of really identifying what the MVP really is. So when I go back to thinking about some common challenges that we have here, and this is where I kind of want to take us through the end of our conversation today, is really around looking at some key problem areas. Like when we start off with the learner, we have too few personas. We didn't go too deep on the personas. We didn't get the interviews in place, or we were struggling to get the right interviews, empathetic interviews in, or we didn't come back and get the refinement of those interviews. Those can be challenges around the empathy side. The problem definition, this is probably one of the toughest phases, is that we've either made the problem too broad or too narrow, or it's not authentic enough to that what's really relevant for the target audience member. The ideation phase is that you allowed it to go way too divergent. It's way off track, so it's really hard to kind of do that. And we want to make sure you have enough divergence in there to get creativity in space. But sometimes you can make it so big that it gets way off track, or if you make it too convergent, like you narrow the field, you're going to really eliminate the possibility of some great ideas. The prototyping phase, using sprints, scrums, and backlog, it's really about understanding how to use those. A lot of folks will get into the prototype and test phase, and we're not really understanding how Agile really works from a robust standpoint. So that takes us into the prototype and test phase. So I wanted to kind of call out a range of the challenges, and it's a great process. We've seen some really great examples of generating some not only good creative ideas, but it's definitely showing from the business side, we've been able to gain some really powerful ultimate learner, performer results in the experiences or journeys that we have pulled out of a design thinking process. So, Kara, I don't know if there's a couple of questions we wanted to touch base on here. I know we're pushing our time, but I wanted to check in.
Yeah, we're good so far. If you want to go ahead and go through the rest of your slides, we can address them at the end. Unless you want me to go through one of them now, I certainly can.
Yeah, if we can do one, that'd be great, Kayla.
All right. Well, do you have any good examples as to where you've applied this or where we've applied this at GP Strategies?
Absolutely. I think one of the best examples is when we were going in to really take a look at our what we call our Leadership Essentials program, and it was how we use that to define a more robust leadership example that would not just only teach basic leadership principles, but we would actually be able to create a more sustainable experience, one where leaders would actually be able to drive better experience and then actually apply it into the field while still within the actual experience overall. So while still in the overall learning experience, they're getting data from the field that shows that there's application and transfer happening. So we've been able to not only show better engagement results and pull-through results and a better experience, but we're also being able to show that they're transferring, leaders are transferring the practices to the field. And so that was one internally at GP we did with one of our own products, but it's very similar to the same kind of things that we've seen when we've applied it to sales academies for our partners, to digital learning programs for a couple of other dimensions, whether it's in the manufacturing space. So those are a couple of examples.
Yep, and also for the person who answered or who asked this question, we have some great articles, and we have one specifically on a case usage that we did here at GP Strategies that we can send out to everybody on the call. So Matt, did you want to go ahead and wrap up right now, or do you want to go through your last couple of slides? I know we've got most everyone still on the call, so if you want to take a few minutes to do that, that would be just fine.
Yeah, so I've actually covered most of the slides. There was one additional one that I had, which really was just real quick on who to include in the process. And so thinking about who do I bring to the table to be able to work through the solution. So you've got your A performers. When you're thinking about designing a learning experience, you want to think about who you're interviewing, who you're bringing to it, not just the top performers, but also the target audience. Where are they in that middle pack, your B population, where you're really trying to move them up to the A performers as you're going through. You want to bring in, obviously, the subject matter experts, the performance support networks, the people that are supporting them, managers, administrative assistants, peers, coaches, mentors. You want to bring all those in. And then the business stakeholders as the ones that are actually going to be the true benefit of this. So that was the one final idea, is that when you're thinking about who do I bring to the table, these are the key folks that we recommend in including in the journey. So that kind of brings us to the last section of the slides that we had here. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt, for this great presentation. We went a couple minutes over, so I apologize about that. If you have a question, go ahead and enter that into the Q&A module at this time. There's one or two more that we'll address here shortly. Obviously, we covered a lot in just over 20 minutes, and there's still more that we could discuss. I do encourage you to continue the conversation with Matt beyond today's session. So, Matt, if you go ahead and flip it to that last slide, your contact info is on here. I encourage everyone to stay in touch with him. He's also active on LinkedIn as well. I'd also like to remind everyone that the recording and slides from today will be sent to the email address that you provided when you registered. So Matt, I'm going to go ahead and do one or two more questions. I know you touched on this a little bit, but someone did ask, how is this different than Agile?
So actually, we've been actually pulling the concepts of Agile into the design thinking process. So we're bringing the best of both approaches. So from the design thinking side, we're really having that focus on the learner and the performer, learning about them before we start to design with it, while also blending, a robust Agile to really drive that prototyping and testing phase. So I see them as overlapping and integrated rather than one or the other.
Great. And then last question I'm going to cover here. If anyone has any other questions, go ahead and keep them coming in. I will collect them and send them to Matt to make sure that we get back in touch with you, but I know we are a few minutes over. Do you have any recommendations where folks on the call can learn more about design thinking?
There are tons of really great resources that are out there and available. For example, there are a couple of courses from IDEO, which is a company that's been doing design thinking for a very long time, been driving what I would say the formal adoption of that process and approach. There are resources available from the Stanford D School. MIT also has some resources that are available. So there are some great, what I consider, articles, some great guides or handbooks out there that start thinking through it, and then even some formal courses from, for example, IDEO. I know has a couple that are just really great.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping things up. I want to say thank you again to today's speaker, Matt Donovan, and thanks to everyone who attended for your time and attention. I do hope that you'll join us again for our future webinars. Our registration for those sessions is available at gpstrategies.com under our resource library. I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful and productive rest of your day. Thank you.